The letter arrives on a Tuesday morning, plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, block letters, careful handwriting, the kind a man uses when he wants to be clearly understood. The message is simple: a number, a deadline, a warning about what happens if the deadline passes. At the bottom of the page, pressed in black ink, a handprint. You do not go to the police. You have been in this country long enough to understand that going to the police is not protection. It is provocation. The men who sent this letter know where your children walk to school. They know which mass your wife attends on Sunday morning. They know the name of your brother in Brooklyn and the address of your parents in Palermo. You pay. Almost everyone pays. And somewhere in a tenement on East 17th Street, a man known as Lupo the Wolf reads the morning newspaper, drinks his coffee, and waits. To understand what the Black Hand became in America, you have to understand what Sicily was producing in the decades before the Great Emigration began. The island had been occupied and exploited by foreign powers for the better part of 2,000 years. The Normans, the Aragonese, the Spanish, the Bourbons. Each successive ruling power had treated Sicily as a resource to be extracted, rather than a society to be governed. By the mid-19th century, when Italian unification nominally brought the island under the authority of the Kingdom of Italy, the structural conditions of Sicilian rural life had changed almost nothing for the peasant majority. Land was concentrated in the hands of a tiny aristocratic class, the latifondisti, who managed their vast estates through intermediaries called gabelotti. The gabelotti collected rents, enforced agreements, and maintained order on the estates through methods that had nothing to do with any official legal system. They were private power, operating in the space where public governance had never reached. Out of this environment, the Mafia did not emerge as a criminal conspiracy in the way American popular culture has always understood it. It emerged as a governance system, a parallel structure of authority that provided, in exchange for tribute and loyalty, the services that the official state either could not or would not deliver: dispute resolution, property protection, contract enforcement, justice, or something that functioned like it, in a society where the official justice system was experienced by ordinary Sicilians as the instrument of their oppressors rather than their protector. The code that sustained this system was omertà, a word derived from the Sicilian term for humility, but meaning in practice something closer to absolute discretion. You did not speak to outside authorities about matters that belonged inside the community. You did not cooperate with police, with courts, with any external power. Disputes were resolved internally or not at all. Grievances were settled privately. The man who went to the authorities was not merely a traitor to his associates. He was a fool who had surrendered his only protection, the community itself, in exchange for the good faith of an institution that had demonstrated for centuries that it did not operate in his interest. This code was not specific to criminal men. It was a survival strategy embedded across Sicilian society through generations of experience with governments that punished the poor for speaking and rewarded the powerful for silence. By the time the mass emigration began in the 1880s, driven by agricultural collapse, crushing taxation imposed by the new Italian state, and the complete absence of economic opportunity for landless peasants, the men who came to America carried omertà not as a criminal affiliation, but as a cultural reflex. It was simply how the world worked. Between 1880 and 1920, approximately 4 million Italians emigrated to the United States. The majority came from the Mezzogiorno, southern Italy and Sicily. They concentrated in the industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest: New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, New Orleans, in dense settlement neighborhoods that replicated, as closely as possible, the social structures they had left. Little Italies were not merely geographic concentrations. They were cultural fortresses, communities that maintained their language, their customs, their religious practices, and their systems of internal authority, precisely because the outside world had given them no reason to trust it. Into those communities, the men who understood how power worked in Sicily carried their knowledge and applied it. The Black Hand was the result, not an organization imported from the old country, not a conspiracy launched from Palermo. A method developed from principles already understood, applied to new conditions that turned out to be even more favorable than the ones it had been designed for. In Sicily, the Mafia competed with the official state for authority. In Little Italy, there was no competition. The official state was absent, hostile, and incomprehensible. The men who understood the fear economy had an open field. The first documented Black Hand letter in the United States arrived in New York City in 1900. By 1905, the New York Police Department was receiving reports of Black Hand extortion at a rate of several hundred cases per year. By 1908, the number had reached into the thousands, and those were only the cases that reached police, representing a fraction of the actual volume of letters delivered, demands made, and payments extracted across the city's Italian neighborhoods. The system worked because it was elegant. It required no central coordination, no organizational infrastructure, no membership roles, no hierarchy that could be dismantled by arresting any single individual. Any man who understood the method could deploy it. Any man with a reputation for violence, or with access to men who had won, could write a letter, press a hand in ink at the bottom, and wait. The Black Hand was a franchise operating without a franchiser, a method so simple and so effective that it replicated itself across every city, with a significant Italian immigrant populations simultaneously, independently, and with consistent results. The letters followed a recognizable pattern that investigators studied, documented, and ultimately could not stop because the pattern itself was not illegal, only the demand it contained. A typical letter opened with a statement of awareness, demonstrating that the writer knew specific details of the target's life, the address of his business, the names of his children, the hour he left for work each morning. This was not accidental information. Black Hand operators spent time in reconnaissance before sending a letter, gathering specifics that would demonstrate to the recipient that the threat was not generic. It was personal. It was specific. It meant the men who sent it had been watching. The demand followed. Specific figures ranged from a few $100s, targeting small shopkeepers and tradesmen, to tens of thousands of dollars aimed at successful businessmen, physicians, opera singers, and anyone whose visible prosperity marked them as capable of paying a larger sum. The figure was calibrated to what the operator believed the target could actually produce. Too high, and the target might conclude that compliance was impossible and seek help. Too low, and the operator left money on the table. The calculation was economic, a predator's assessment of sustainable extraction. The deadline was always precise. 5 days, 10 days, a specific date and time, pay by this moment, or face the consequence. The consequence was spelled out with varying degrees of specificity depending on the operator's style. But the structure was consistent. Non-payment would result in violence. The violence would not be limited to the recipient. It would extend to his family, his property, his livelihood. The letter was not a robbery demand. It was a business proposition, a purchase of safety, paid in installments to whoever had established the credibility to sell it. The credibility was the key element, and it explains why the Black Hand functioned as a system that made its individual operators more dangerous than any single criminal's personal capacity for violence would suggest. A man who received a Black Hand letter was not evaluating the specific threat capacity of the specific individual who sent it. He was evaluating the general reputation of the Black Hand as a category, a reputation built across thousands of documented cases of successful enforcement, delivered through community knowledge rather than any formal announcement. He knew, because his neighbors knew, and his relatives knew, and the newspaper accounts confirmed that men who had not paid had been shot, had had their businesses burned, had had family members kidnapped or killed. The specific sender did not need to have personally committed any of those acts. He needed only to credibly represent the system that had. This is what made the Black Hand qualitatively different from ordinary extortion, and why law enforcement found it so resistant to standard investigative techniques. Arresting a specific individual for a specific letter disrupted one transaction in a system that was conducting thousands simultaneously. The system itself had no address, no leadership, no organizational structure to dismantle. Convicting a specific operator removed him, but left every other operator operating exactly as before. The fear that made the letters effective was not generated by any individual. It was a collective resource, a shared asset belonging to everyone who operated under the Black Hand method, and it could not be confiscated. The geographic reach of the system extended to every major American city with a significant Italian immigrant population. In New Orleans, Black Hand operations concentrated in the Treme and French Quarter Italian communities, building on a tradition of Sicilian, organized crime that had already produced the 1890 assassination of Police Chief David Hennessy, the event that triggered the largest mass lynching in American history, when 11 Sicilian men were dragged from the parish jail and murdered by a mob. In Chicago, Black Hand operations ran through the near North Side Italian neighborhoods and connected to figures who would later become central players in the Prohibition-era organized crime structure in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Pittsburgh, in San Francisco. The letters arrived, the black handprints marked the demand, and the payments flowed. New Orleans deserves specific attention because it illustrates the Black Hand's relationship to political and police corruption with a clarity that New York's more complex institutional landscape sometimes obscured. The city's Italian community had been targeted by extortionists operating from within. Since at least the 1880s, the police response was not merely inadequate. It was frequently complicit. Officers who operated in Italian neighborhoods understood that Black Hand operators provided a form of community control that the police themselves could not achieve through legitimate means. The informal arrangement, tolerance in exchange for a functioning fear economy that kept the immigrant community contained and manageable, made the police less a counterweight to the Black Hand than a structural element supporting it. The newspapers named the phenomenon, and in doing so, gave it a branding that paradoxically enhanced its power. The term Black Hand, La Mano Nera, appeared in American journalism from approximately 1903 onward, originating in accounts of extortion letters bearing the handprint symbol. The coverage was extensive, often lurid, and consistently framed the Black Hand as a mysterious criminal organization with roots in Sicily, a secret society with formal membership, hierarchical leadership, and coordinated operations across the country. This framing was almost entirely wrong. The Black Hand had no central organization, no formal membership, and no coordinated national strategy. It was a method, not an institution. But the media's mischaracterizations served the operator's interests better than accurate reporting would have. A mysterious secret society with reach across the entire country, with organizational depth that could survive the arrest of any single member, with connections to the old country and a tradition of violence stretching back generations. That was a more frightening proposition than the accurate description. Independent operators using a replicable method that had no more organizational coherence than a business model. The legend did the work. The legend was free, self-perpetuating, and extraordinarily effective at producing the fear that made the letters pay. The economics of the system were substantial. Conservative estimates from investigators and journalists covering the Black Hand phenomenon between 1900 and 1920 placed annual extortion payments in the Italian communities of New York City alone at several $million per year. Total national extraction across all cities and all operators, across the two-decade peak of Black Hand activity, likely reached into the tens of millions, an enormous sum extracted from communities that were themselves among the poorest in urban America, paid out of the thin margins of small businesses, the wages of laborers, the savings of families who had crossed an ocean to escape poverty and found a different version of extraction waiting for them on the other side. The human cost was not only financial. The fear economy the Black Hand maintained. The constant awareness that success attracted attention, that visibility invited predation, that the right response to achieving something was to hide it, shaped the economic behavior of Italian immigrant communities in ways that persisted for decades. Small businessmen deliberately understated their prosperity. Successful men avoided visible displays of wealth that might mark them as productive targets. The rational response to operating in a Black Hand environment was to appear as poor as possible, which meant that the very communities the Black Hand was extracting from were simultaneously being suppressed in their capacity to accumulate the capital that might eventually have produced enough prosperity to resist the system. The Black Hand didn't just steal money, it stole the conditions under which money could safely be made and kept. His real name was Ignazio Lupo. He was born in Palermo in 1877, the son of a merchant family of modest but stable means. Not the grinding poverty of the rural peasantry, but not the insulated comfort of the aristocratic class either. He grew up in a Palermo neighborhood where the Mafia's presence was not a rumor or a newspaper story, but a structural fact of daily commercial life. Who you knew, who you owed, who protected your interests, and who threatened them. These were the practical questions of existence in the neighborhood where Lupo came of age, and he learned the answers earlier and more completely than most. In 1898, at the age of 21, Ignazio Lupo killed a man in Palermo. The details of the killing, the specific dispute, the exact circumstances were never definitively established in any official proceeding, in part because Lupo did not stay in Palermo long enough for any official proceeding to occur. He fled. He made his way to New York City, arriving in 1899, and settled in East Harlem, the dense Italian neighborhood in Upper Manhattan that would become the primary geography of his criminal operations for the next decade. New York in 1899 was precisely the environment that a man of Lupo's background and training was designed to exploit. Little Italy on the Lower East Side, East Harlem, and the Italian neighborhoods of Brooklyn and the Bronx together housed several 100,000 Italian immigrants, the majority of them Sicilian, the majority of them desperately poor, and virtually all of them operating in a relationship with American authority that ranged from deep suspicion to outright hostility. The police did not speak their language. The courts did not understand their circumstances. The political system had nothing to offer them, and very little interest in their welfare. They were a community that had reproduced, in the tenements of Upper Manhattan, the fundamental condition of Sicilian peasant life. The official state was irrelevant to your survival, and the men who actually governed your daily existence were the ones who had established the capacity for violence and the willingness to use it. Lupo established himself with methodical patience. He opened a legitimate business, an import grocery store on Prince Street in Little Italy, that served simultaneously as a commercial operation and as the visible, respectable front for his criminal activities. The grocery provided a plausible explanation for his income, a legitimate reason to be known and visited by the members of the community he intended to exploit, and a location that served as an informal hub for the network he was building. The network was built on relationship and reputation in equal measure. Lupo cultivated connections to Sicilian men who had come to New York with backgrounds similar to his, men who understood the methods of the old country, who had the standing in their communities that came from being known as capable of violence, and who were looking for the organizational infrastructure that would make their individual capacities more profitable than they could be operating alone. He connected himself to the Morello family, specifically to Giuseppe Morello, known as the clutch hand for the deformed right hand that had failed to develop properly, who was building what would eventually become recognized as the first organized crime family in New York City. Lupo married Salvatore Morello's widow in 1903, cementing a family connection to the Morello organization that made him not merely an associate, but a structural member of the most powerful Italian criminal organization in New York. But Lupo's specific domain, his personal area of operation, and the source of his particular notoriety was the fear economy. He was not primarily a bootlegger or a counterfeiter, though he participated in both. He was an extortionist of extraordinary effectiveness, a man whose reputation for violence was so precisely calibrated to the community's collective knowledge that his letters, when they arrived, were treated as a qualitatively different category of communication than those from other operators. Lupo the Wolf did not send idle threats. The evidence for this reputation came from what investigators found at 318 East 107th Street in East Harlem, a stable that Lupo controlled and used as a disposal site. The property was known in the neighborhood through the opaque but surprisingly efficient communication network of the Italian community as a place connected to disappearances. Men who had defied Lupo or who had become liabilities for other reasons had a pattern of last being seen in the vicinity of East 107th Street and subsequently never being seen anywhere else. When investigators eventually examined the property, they found human remains. The exact number was never definitively established, but estimates from investigators who examined the site placed it at 60 or more victims over the period of Lupo's operations. The murder stable, as it became known in press coverage, was not a criminal operation in the organizational sense. It was a disposal infrastructure, the physical evidence of an enforcement system that required dead men to remain unfound. The specific violence that earned Lupo his particular status in the fear economy of East Harlem went beyond what even other Black Hand operators considered necessary, where other operators threatened and then escalated when payment was not received. Lupo operated on a different timeline, one in which the distance between threat and consequence was short enough to make calculation about non-compliance essentially futile. You did not have time to organize resistance. You did not have time to consult with other community members about collective action against him. You had time to pay or to understand, very quickly, what not paying meant. His physical presence reinforced the psychological architecture. Lupo was described by contemporaries and by law enforcement investigators as a man whose bearing communicated danger not through bluster or explicit threat, but through a quality of stillness, a composure so complete that it read as indifference to consequences, which in a man with his known history was the most frightening thing possible. The wolf in the name was not an ironic designation. It described something that people who encountered him consistently reported recognizing. Beyond his personal operation, Lupo's significance to the Black Hand story is organizational. He demonstrated, more clearly and more durably than any other single figure in the system's history, that the Black Hand method could be elevated from the opportunistic activity of individual operators into something approaching a sustained criminal enterprise. Not a structured organization in the way the later American Mafia would become organized, with formal hierarchies and defined territories and explicit rules of membership, but a network connected through family ties, through shared background, through mutual dependence and mutual threat, that maintained consistent operational discipline across a period of years and across the geographic spread of multiple New York neighborhoods simultaneously. He did not run the Black Hand. No one ran the Black Hand, but he was its most complete expression. The single figure whose biography contains, in concentrated form, every element of what made the system function. The Sicilian roots, the murder that created the need for flight, the New World community perfectly structured for exploitation, the patience required to build reputation before deploying it, the violence calibrated to communicate information rather than merely cause harm, the legitimate business front that provided cover and connection simultaneously, the family alliance that provided organizational reach, and the specific, located address, 318 East 107th Street, where the system's consequences could be found in the ground if anyone was willing to dig. The barrel murder that appeared on the morning of April 14, 1903, at 743 East 11th Street in Manhattan, was not the first murder connected to Black Hand operations in New York City, but it was the one that forced the city's police establishment to confront, for the first time with any seriousness, the nature of what was operating inside the Italian immigrant community. The victim was found stuffed inside a flour barrel, his body folded with the mechanical efficiency of a man disposed of by people who had done this before. He was identified eventually as Benedetto Madonia, a Sicilian counterfeiter who had been involved with the Morello organization before a dispute over money. The specific details were disputed among investigators and never fully resolved, led to his execution. His throat had been cut. He had been stabbed 17 times. His genitals had been severed and placed in his mouth, a Sicilian punishment reserved for men considered to have betrayed a trust in a specific and personal way. The disposal in a barrel was practical rather than symbolic. A body in a barrel is easier to transport, less conspicuous to move, and more difficult to identify quickly than a body left in the street. The barrel murder investigation was the first serious attempt by New York law enforcement to penetrate the Black Hand's operational structure, and what it revealed was the depth of the investigative challenge. The men investigators identified as responsible, Giuseppe Morello and his associates, were known figures in the community. Their reputations were understood. Their connections were, at a general level, suspected. But The evidentiary standard of American criminal prosecution requires more than reputation and suspicion. It requires witnesses. And witnesses, in the Italian immigrant community operating under the social architecture of omertà, were essentially unavailable, regardless of what those witnesses personally knew or had personally seen. The community's silence was not, in most cases, the product of loyalty to the men who had committed the killing. It was the product of rational calculation under conditions of extreme vulnerability. A witness who testified against a Black Hand figure faced retaliation that the police could not reliably prevent. The police could offer a court date. They could offer, in theory, a prosecution. What they could not offer was protection against the men who would interpret that testimony as a betrayal, requiring a response. In the hierarchy of threats that an Italian immigrant in East Harlem faced in 1903, a Black Hand retaliation was immediate, certain, and lethal. A theoretical prosecutorial benefit was distant, uncertain, and contingent on a legal system the community had no particular reason to trust. The Barrel murder case ultimately produced the arrest and trial of Morello and several associates. It produced no convictions. The witnesses who had been identified failed to testify with sufficient specificity to support the charges. The men returned to their operations. The lesson for the community was exactly the wrong one from law enforcement's perspective. It confirmed that the official system could not protect those who cooperated with it. The kidnappings were, in some ways, more operationally significant than the murders as a demonstration of what the Black Hand system was capable of sustaining. Kidnapping required the extended maintenance of a captive, the management of negotiation, the collection of ransom, and the return of the victim, a logistical operation demanding both organizational capacity and a confidence in operating without interference that murders, which required only a moment's execution, did not. The fact that the Black Hand conducted kidnapping operations successfully in the densely populated and nominally law-enforced environment of New York City across a sustained period illustrated the degree to which the community's silence insulated the system from outside disruption. The kidnapping of Antonio Mannino in 1909 illustrated the system's operation at its most extended and most brutal. Mannino, a successful Brooklyn businessman, received a Black Hand letter demanding $1,500. He went to the police, a decision that, even at the time, was understood in the community as a form of courage bordering on recklessness. Before any investigative response could be organized, his son was abducted from the street outside their home. The kidnappers made contact and doubled their demand to account for what they characterized as the cost of his cooperation with police. Mannino paid. His son was returned. The men who had taken him were never identified, never charged, and continued operating in the same neighborhood. The message the Mannino case sent, the message that every kidnapping successfully conducted and every ransom successfully collected sent, was systemic rather than individual. It confirmed that the Black Hand's capacity to enforce consequences for non-compliance and for cooperation with authorities was real, current, and not diminished by any investigative activity that law enforcement was capable of organizing. The fear economy required these confirmations to function. Every successful kidnapping was an advertisement. Every murdered informant was a published rate card. Every man who paid and was left alone, and every man who refused and was not, kept the market in operation. The bombing campaigns that Black Hand operators used against businesses and property demonstrated a different dimension of the system's violence, one aimed not at individuals but at assets, and through assets at the financial sustainability of resistance. A man who refused a Black Hand demand might be warned through violence against his property before violence against his person. His shop window shattered, his storefront dynamited in the early morning hours before his family arrived, his delivery cart burned in the street. These acts served multiple functions simultaneously. They caused direct financial harm, reducing the target's capacity to sustain refusal. They signaled to the surrounding community that the Black Hand's reach extended beyond personal violence to the entire economic infrastructure a family depended on, and they maintained the system's reputation for follow-through at a cost, property destruction, that was lower than the cost of murder and more visible in its demonstration of capability. The children of successful men were the most vulnerable targets of all, and Black Hand operators understood this with a precision that reflected deep knowledge of their community's values and emotional architecture. Italian immigrant fathers, particularly those who had achieved the visible prosperity of business ownership or professional status, understood their success as something held in trust for their children. The point of the Immigrant project was not personal comfort, but the establishment of conditions in which the next generation could live differently. Threatening a child was not merely threatening a person. It was threatening the entire meaning of everything the father had sacrificed. The emotional leverage this provided was total, and the Black Hand operators who understood it could often bypass the extended negotiation and resistance that a purely financial demand might have produced. Pay immediately, or the child pays instead. There was nothing to calculate. Men paid. Joseph Petrosino was born in Padula, in the Campania region of southern Italy, in 1860. He came to New York as a child, grew up in the Five Points neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, and worked as a bootblack, a street vendor, and a laborer before being hired by the New York Police Department in 1883. He was, at the time of his hiring, the only Italian-born officer on the force. He would remain one of very few for years. His appointment to the NYPD was the result of the specific intervention of Inspector Thomas Burns, who had identified in Petrosino the combination of qualities that made him useful in ways no other officer on the force could replicate. He spoke Italian, Neapolitan Italian, and enough Sicilian to manage the dialect differences that separated the communities he would need to penetrate. He understood the cultural framework governing those communities from the inside. He was physically formidable, compact, strong, with the kind of presence that communicated capability without requiring demonstration, and he was possessed of a personal courage that his subsequent career would establish as something beyond ordinary professional bravery. Petrosino was constitutionally incapable of being frightened away from a thing he had decided to pursue. This quality would eventually kill him. It was also, for the 26 years he spent fighting Black Hand crime in New York, the most essential tool he had. He built his knowledge of the Italian criminal community through a method that was both obvious and exhausting. He went into it. He spent years developing informants, learning which men in the community had legitimate grievances against the Black Hand operators that might outweigh their cultural conditioning toward silence. He cultivated relationships with community leaders, priests, businessmen, newspaper editors, who were themselves targets of extortion, and who understood that the Black Hand's operations were destroying the conditions under which Italian immigrant life could develop into anything beyond sustained predation. He attended community events, appeared in neighborhood institutions, made himself a known and trusted presence in the geography his targets also occupied. He was not an outside investigator gathering information from a distance. He was inside the community, Imperfectly, always partially, but inside in ways no other law enforcement figure of his era came close to replicating. In 1905, NYPD Commissioner Theodore Bingham formally established the Italian Squad, a unit of Italian-speaking detectives operating under Petrosino's command, specifically dedicated to investigating Black Hand crime. The squad was the first specialized law enforcement unit in American history created specifically to address organized crime within an immigrant community. Its creation acknowledged, at an institutional level, something that had been obvious on the street for years, that Black Hand crime required investigative approaches that general detective work could not provide, and that those approaches required personnel with specific cultural and linguistic capabilities that the existing department could not supply from its regular ranks. The Italian Squad's operational achievements were real. Petrosino and his detectives identified Black Hand operators, gathered evidence sufficient for prosecution in cases where the evidence did not depend entirely on community witness testimony, and succeeded in deporting a number of figures who were found to have criminal records in Italy. A legal mechanism that bypassed the witness testimony problem by making the defendant's own documented foreign criminal history the basis for removal from the country. Between 1905 and 1909, the Italian Squad was responsible for the arrest of over 500 individuals on charges related to Black Hand extortion, bombing, and associated crimes. But the structural limitations of what any law enforcement unit could accomplish against the Black Hand system were illustrated more clearly by the Italian Squad's operation than by anything that had come before. Arrests required prosecutions, prosecutions required witnesses, witnesses that the NYPD, operating in a city where the Black Hand's retaliatory capacity was demonstrated on a near-weekly basis, could not credibly guarantee. The cases that produced convictions were the cases where physical evidence existed independent of witness testimony. A letter with identifiable handwriting, a bomb-making device traced to a specific supplier, a counterfeit bill connected to a specific printing operation. These cases were a fraction of the full volume of Black Hand activity that Petrosino and his squad identified and documented. The community's relationship with Petrosino himself was more complex than the simple narrative of a hero fighting for his people suggests. He was respected, genuinely, widely, by the community members who understood that the Black Hand was destroying their neighborhoods, and that Petrosino was the most serious opponent that destruction had found. He was also feared by a significant portion of that community, not because he was brutal, but because his effectiveness made cooperation with him a legible choice in a way that cooperation with the general police force was not, which made the men he was pursuing treat his informants as a specific and targeted threat. A community member known to be providing information to Petrosino was in a more dangerous position than a community member known to be providing information to the regular police. The regular police couldn't do anything with the information. Petrosino could. He received death threats routinely. They were documented in his official files and largely ignored in his personal behavior. He did not slow down. He did not request reassignment to work that was less dangerous. He understood what he was doing with a clarity that the threats, however serious, could not displace. The Black Hand was operating in his community. He was the most capable instrument available for opposing it. That was sufficient. In the autumn of 1908, Petrosino developed a theory that would become the operational basis for a mission to Sicily that he correctly believed represented the most significant investigative opportunity his career had produced. And that would, within 6 months, produce his death. The theory was straightforward and well supported by the evidence he had accumulated over more than 2 decades of investigation. A significant portion of the men operating Black Hand extortion schemes in New York had criminal records in Italy, records that, under American immigration law, should have barred their entry to the United States. If those records could be obtained, documented, and formally presented to American immigration authorities, the legal mechanism for deporting the men who held them would exist independent of any witness testimony problem. The Black Hand could be attacked not through prosecution of its current operation, but through the retroactive documentation of its operators' criminal histories, eliminating them from American territory on the basis of their pasts rather than their present crimes. It was a sound theory. It was also one that required someone to go to Sicily and gather the records. Petrosino decided that someone was him. He traveled in secret. The mission to Sicily was classified at the highest level the NYPD could manage for an international operation, which, as subsequent events would demonstrate, was not high enough. Petrosino departed New York on February 9, 1909, traveling under a false name with no official escort, and with instructions to establish contact with Italian law enforcement authorities in Palermo, who had agreed to cooperate with the record-gathering mission. The secrecy was considered essential. If Black Hand figures in New York learned that Petrosino was in Sicily gathering criminal records on their associates and connections, the mission would be compromised and Petrosino would be in danger. The secrecy failed almost immediately. How the information reached New York from Palermo, whether through a leak in the NYPD itself, through the Italian law enforcement channels Petrosino was using, or through the Morello family's own communication network connecting New York to Sicily, was never definitively established. What is established through the documentary record of subsequent investigations on both sides of the Atlantic is that by early March 1909, the men who wanted Petrosino dead knew he was in Palermo. On the evening of March 12, 1909, Petrosino dined alone at a restaurant in the center of Palermo and then walked through the city toward the Piazza Marina, the large public square near the waterfront that had been a center of Palermo's civic life for centuries. The evening was warm for early spring. The piazza was not empty. There were people in the square, at cafes on the surrounding streets, moving through the area in the normal pattern of an evening in a Mediterranean city. At approximately 8:45 in the evening, 2 men approached Petrosino in the Piazza Marina and shot him 4 times. He was struck by all 4 shots, 2 in the head, 2 in the body. He died in the Piazza Marina without regaining consciousness. He was 48 years old. The assassination of Joseph Petrosino in the Piazza Marina in Palermo was the most audacious killing of an American law enforcement officer in history to that point. It was planned across an ocean. It was executed in a foreign country. It demonstrated with a completeness that no argument or documentary evidence could have achieved that the Black Hand's organizational reach was not a theory or a journalistic exaggeration. It was an operational reality. The men who ran the most significant Black Hand operations in New York City had the capacity to identify that their most dangerous investigative opponent was in Sicily, to communicate that information across the Atlantic, quickly enough to organize a response, and to carry out that response in a foreign city while their principals remained safely on the other side of the water. The investigation that followed the killing produced, in the end, almost nothing of prosecutorial value. Italian authorities arrested a man named Antonino Passananti in connection with the killing and later charged Carlo Costantino, a mafioso, with connections to the Palermo underworld. The evidence was disputed, and the proceedings were complicated by jurisdictional questions, the death of key witnesses, and the general impenetrability of the Palermo criminal environment to outside investigation, the same conditions mirroring precisely that had made Black Hand prosecutions impossible in New York. One suspect was eventually convicted. The men who had organized the killing from New York were never charged. The full operational picture of who ordered the assassination, who communicated the intelligence about Petrosino's presence, and who directed the men who carried it out, was never established in any legal proceeding. Giuseppe Morello, who was by 1909 already under investigation for counterfeiting by federal agents, and would be arrested later that same year, was widely believed by investigators on both sides of the Atlantic to have been centrally involved in organizing the assassination. The belief was supported by the operational logic of the situation. Petrosino's record-gathering mission in Sicily was a direct threat to the Morello family's operations and by informant intelligence gathered in the years after the killing. It was never established to the legal standard required for prosecution. New York received the news of Petrosino's death on the morning of March 13, 1909. The reaction was the largest public mourning the city's Italian community had ever produced. An estimated 250,000 people lined the streets of Manhattan to watch Petrosino's funeral cortege. The city's Italian-language newspapers published editions bordered in black. Messages of condolence arrived from the Italian government, from police forces across Europe, and from the thousands of individual community members whose relationship with Petrosino had been the foundation of whatever investigative capacity the Italian squad had managed to build. The operational consequence of the assassination was precisely what it had been designed to produce. The Italian squad continued to exist after Petrosino's death, but it never again operated with the investigative depth and community penetration that Petrosino had spent 26 years constructing. The men who succeeded him were capable investigators, but they were not Petrosino. They did not have his relationships, his community knowledge, his specific combination of cultural insider status and law enforcement authority that had made him uniquely effective. The killing had removed the irreplaceable element from the only law enforcement apparatus that had come close to threatening the Black Hand's operational continuity. The Black Hand continued. Petrosino did not. The message the killing sent extended beyond law enforcement. It told every community member who had been weighing the possibility of cooperation with authorities exactly what cooperation could cost in the most extreme case. If the most capable, most protected, most institutionally supported investigator of Black Hand crime in America could be killed while on an official mission in a foreign country, then the ordinary community member who provided information to a detective in East Harlem had essentially no protection at all. The rational response to Petrosino's assassination, for anyone calculating the risks of cooperation, was silence. Deep, permanent, structural silence. The killing was an investment in the fear economy that paid returns for years. The Secret Service agent who broke the Black Hand's most powerful operational network was not investigating the Black Hand. He was investigating counterfeit money. William Flynn was the chief of the New York office of the United States Secret Service, and in 1909 he was pursuing what had become, over several years of investigation, the most sophisticated counterfeiting operation his agency had ever encountered. The operation was producing high-quality $5 bills. The quality was impressive enough that the bills circulated through the Italian immigrant community and into the broader commercial economy before detection. And the trail had led Flynn's investigators through a complex chain of financial evidence and informant intelligence to the Morello family in East Harlem. The connection between the Morello organization and Black Hand extortion was known to Flynn and his investigators. They had been tracking the family's operations long enough to understand that counterfeiting was the financial infrastructure beneath a broader criminal enterprise that included extortion, murder for hire, and the organizational network connecting New York's Sicilian criminal community to criminal figures in both Sicily and other American cities. But counterfeiting was the federal crime. Black Hand extortion was, in the jurisdictional framework of 1909, a local matter. The Secret Service had legal authority over the former and none over the latter. This jurisdictional distinction was not merely a procedural nicety. It was the structural fact that had allowed the Black Hand to operate in the space between local incompetence and federal disinterest for nearly 2 decades. Local police forces, the NYPD, the Chicago Police Department, the New Orleans Police, had both the jurisdictional authority and the investigative limitations that made serious prosecution of Black Hand crime essentially impossible in practice. The federal government had the investigative capacity, in the form of agencies with the resources, the legal authority to cross jurisdictional lines, and the institutional distance from the local political corruption that compromised local police, but had, until the counterfeiting investigation, lacked a legal hook that brought Black Hand operations within the scope of federal jurisdiction. The counterfeiting connection provided that hook. The bills the Morello organization was producing were federal crimes. The production infrastructure, printing equipment, distribution networks, the financial flows connecting the counterfeiting operation to the broader criminal enterprise crossed state lines and therefore federal jurisdiction. The investigation Flynn constructed was one of the most sophisticated financial crime investigations the Secret Service had undertaken to that point. It required years of surveillance, the development of informants within the tightly closed Sicilian criminal community, the meticulous documentation of financial transactions across multiple fronts, and the patience to build a case that would survive the evidentiary challenges that had defeated every previous prosecution of Morello-connected crime. On November 15, 1909, 8 months after Petrosino's assassination in Palermo, at a moment when the Black Hand's reputation for invulnerability was at its historical peak, federal agents arrested Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo simultaneously, along with 14 other members and associates of their organization. The arrests were coordinated and simultaneous across multiple locations in New York to prevent any warning from reaching the targets in time for flight. Lupo was taken at his grocery store on Prince Street. Morello was arrested at his home in East Harlem. The trial that followed in January 1910 was a federal proceeding before a judge with no local political entanglements, prosecuted by federal attorneys operating outside the web of relationships between the New York political establishment and the Italian criminal community. The evidentiary case Flynn had built was financial and forensic, rather than dependent on witness testimony. The counterfeiting evidence consisted of physical items, financial records, and documented transactions that did not require the cooperation of terrified community members who could be intimidated into silence. The defense that had been effective in every previous proceeding against Morello-connected figures. The defense that relied on the impossibility of finding witnesses willing to testify was largely irrelevant against physical evidence that spoke for itself. Giuseppe Morello was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Ignazio Lupo was convicted and sentenced to 30 years. The sentences were the longest imposed on organized crime figures in American history to that point. Lupo entered the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary at the age of 33, facing the prospect of release in his 60s, a span of incarceration that, if served in full, would effectively remove him from any productive criminal role for the remainder of his physically capable years. The effect on the Black Hand system was significant and immediate, and also, in the longer view, limited. The Morello family's specific organizational structure was disrupted. Lupo's personal operation in East Harlem was dismantled. The specific network of men who had operated under their organizational umbrella lost its most capable leadership. The fear economy in the neighborhoods they had dominated contracted, at least temporarily, as their successors sorted out the new operational landscape. But the Black Hand was a method, not an organization. Dismantling the Morello network was the operational equivalent of prosecuting a successful franchise operator. It disrupted that franchise's operations without affecting the franchise model's replicability. Other operators continued. Other letters were written and delivered. Other payments were extracted. The removal of Lupo and Morello from the street created opportunity for the operators who had been working in their shadow, men who had learned the system as associates or observers, and who now had the operational space to expand their own activities without competing against the most established and feared names in the business. The federal prosecutorial approach Flynn demonstrated did, however, change the strategic landscape in which Black Hand operations occurred going forward. After 1909, Black Hand operators understood that federal investigators with resources and jurisdictional reach beyond any local police force could bring effective cases against criminal organizations that had previously considered themselves beyond serious prosecution. The response was not the end of extortion. It was the beginning of an awareness that the methods of operation needed to evolve to reduce the federal exposure that the counterfeiting connection had created. The evolution pointed in one direction. The Black Hand's vulnerability was its financial infrastructure. The counterfeiting operations, the financial paper trails, the physical evidence of money production that gave federal agencies their jurisdictional hook, bootlegging, which would arrive with prohibition in 1920, left different kinds of evidence, created different kinds of federal exposure, and generated revenues so overwhelming that the comparative profitability of individual extortion letters became almost quaint. The men who had run the Black Hand saw the future coming. The question was whether they would build it or be absorbed into the structure that others built first. Lupo himself was released early from his 30-year sentence, a commutation arranged in 1920 through political connections that remained active despite a decade of incarceration, demonstrated that the network survived, even when its most prominent members were imprisoned. He returned to New York and returned immediately to criminal activity, conducting extortion operations in the changed landscape of Prohibition-era organized crime. He was eventually convicted again, this time for a bakery extortion scheme, and returned to prison. He died in 1947 in Brooklyn at the age of 70. Lupo the Wolf outlived his era and died in it at the same time. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, and the American government banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages for the entire country. The decision transformed the criminal economy of the United States overnight in ways that no legislative drafters had anticipated, and that every criminal organization in the country immediately understood. The scale of what Prohibition created was not comprehensible from inside the political framework that produced it. The temperance movement had been building for decades toward this moment of legislative triumph, and its proponents understood they were eliminating a social evil that had caused documented harm to families, communities, and public health. What they had not accounted for was the economics of demand. Tens of millions of Americans consumed alcohol regularly and had no intention of stopping because a constitutional amendment told them to. The desire was unchanged. The legal supply was eliminated. The gap between desire and legal supply was the most profitable criminal opportunity in American history. Bootlegging revenues in a single major American city, Chicago, New York, Detroit, dwarfed anything the Black Hand had ever extracted from immigrant communities. Al Capone's Chicago operation at its peak generated an estimated $60 million per year from bootlegging and related operations. The Torrio organization that Capone inherited had been making $30 million before Capone's expansion. The Jewish bootlegging networks supplying the Northeast. Arnold Rothstein's organization, the Purple Gang in Detroit, the Reinfeld Syndicate in New Jersey, operated at comparable scale. The Italian organizations in New York that had grown out of the old Black Hand networks, and the Morello family's successors, were positioned to capture a portion of this revenue that exceeded, by an order of magnitude, the total extraction of the Black Hand system at its peak. The men who had operated Black Hand extortion in the previous 2 decades faced a clear choice: evolve into the bootlegging economy, or be left behind in a criminal landscape that had been completely restructured by the new opportunity. The choice was not abstract. It was presented in operational terms. The bootlegging economy required organization, supply chains connecting to Canadian or Caribbean sources of alcohol, or domestic production operations of sufficient scale to meet demand. Distribution networks covering geographic territories, enforcement capacity to protect territory from competitors, and the political and law enforcement relationships required to operate at this scale without constant prosecution. None of these requirements could be met by the scattered, independent, franchise-style operators who had characterized the Black Hand at its peak. The organizational response to Prohibition was the construction of the American Mafia in its modern form. The process was neither smooth nor instantaneous. It was violent, contentious, and played out across a decade of internal conflict within the Italian criminal world. Conflict that culminated in the Castellamarese War of 1930 and 1931, a brutal internal struggle between factions led by Salvatore Maranzano and Joe Masseria that killed dozens of men across New York before Maranzano's victory established, briefly, a hierarchical structure he called Cosa Nostra, our thing. Maranzano's structure was modeled explicitly on the Roman military hierarchy: boss, underboss, capos, soldiers, associates, a chain of command designed to bring organizational discipline to what had been, under the Black Hand model, an essentially anarchic collection of independent operators. He divided New York among 5 family structures, each with defined territory and defined leadership. He appointed himself the boss of bosses, the capo di tutti capi, with supreme authority over all. He was killed months after establishing this structure in September 1931 by men acting on the orders of Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, who correctly identified Maranzano's personal ambition as a structural problem that needed to be eliminated before it consumed everything they had built. Luciano abolished the boss of bosses position and established instead the Commission, a coordinating body representing the leadership of the major American-Italian organized crime families, designed to resolve disputes, coordinate major decisions, and prevent the kind of internal warfare that had just killed dozens of men and attracted enormous law enforcement attention. The Commission model, rational, institutional, designed for sustainable operation, rather than individual domination, was the organizational endpoint of the journey that had begun in the Black Hand letters of the early 1900s. The method of the Black Hand, the fear economy, the systematic extraction of tribute from the communities where the organization operated, the enforcement through violence calibrated to communicate information rather than merely cause harm, was preserved intact within the new organizational structure. What changed was the scale, the discipline, the geographic reach, and the revenue base. The 5 families that emerged from the Castellamarese War operated Black Hand-style extortion as one revenue stream among several. They also ran bootlegging, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and eventually narcotics distribution. The extortion was not abandoned. It was systematized and scaled within a structure capable of sustaining it indefinitely. The men who had been Black Hand operators a decade earlier were the rank and file of this new structure. The soldiers and capos of the 5 families, the men who knew the neighborhoods, knew the fear economy, knew which businesses and which community members could be approached for tribute and how to calibrate the approach. Their knowledge was the organizational memory of the new mafia. The mafia did not absorb the Black Hand's methods the way a conqueror absorbs a defeated enemy's territory. It grew out of those methods, the way a plant grows from the seed that preceded it. The transformation was also a class transformation within the Italian-American criminal world. The Black Hand had been, at its base, a system operating primarily within and against the Italian immigrant working class. Grocers, barbers, laborers, small businessmen, the men who had come to America with nothing and were building something, and were therefore targets. The organized crime families that emerged from the Prohibition era operated across a much wider economic and social landscape. They controlled labor unions, the International Longshoremen's Association, various Teamsters locals, construction trades unions, giving them influence over industries and economic sectors that had nothing to do with the Italian immigrant community. They maintained relationships with politicians and law enforcement at levels that the Black Hand's local community corruption had never approached. They owned legitimate businesses, restaurants, construction companies, waste management firms, legitimate food distribution operations that served as both cover and genuine revenue alongside the criminal operations. The ethnic geography of American organized crime in the post-Prohibition era was also different from what the Black Hand era had produced. The National Crime Syndicate established by Luciano, Lansky, and their associates in 1931 was explicitly multi-ethnic. A coordination structure that included the Jewish criminal organizations of New York, Cleveland, and Detroit alongside the Italian families. Lansky himself was the syndicate's financial architect, the man who developed the techniques of money laundering, offshore banking, and casino skimming that would sustain organized crime's financial infrastructure for decades. The Black Hand had been a specifically Sicilian and southern Italian methodology, operating within the boundaries of the Italian immigrant community. The National Crime Syndicate operated across ethnic boundaries and economic sectors in ways the Black Hand operators of 1905 had never imagined, and would not have been organizationally capable of sustaining. The Black Hand's legacy within this larger structure was both profound and officially unacknowledged within the organization itself. The Mafia did not tell its history as a story that began with the Black Hand letters of the 1880s and 1890s. Its mythology preferred the Sicilian Mafia origin story, the tradition of the vendetta, the code of honor, the brotherhood. The fear economy and the extortion letter were not romantic material. They were the working-class origins of an organization that had developed significant pretensions to something more elevated. The men who ran the 5 families in the 1940s and 1950s preferred to think of themselves as businessmen and community figures, not as the inheritors of a tradition that had terrorized immigrant grocery store owners with black handprints pressed on threatening letters. But the inheritance was real. The enforcement methods the Mafia used to maintain tribute payments from legitimate businesses, what they called street taxes, what the law called extortion, were direct lineal descendants of the Black Hand letter. The logic was identical. The delivery mechanism was different. Instead of a letter with a handprint, a capo sent a soldier to have a conversation with a business owner. Instead of a deadline and a sum, there was an understanding, an ongoing relationship of tribute payments that continued indefinitely, calibrated to the business's capacity to pay, enforced through the credible threat of violence against the business and the business owner's physical safety. The method had been refined and institutionalized and made continuous rather than episodic. The fear economy had been reorganized into a subscription model. The Black Hand had written the first chapter. The Commission was just the mature version of the same story. The last documented Black Hand letter in New York City was not a transitional moment. There was no announcement. No final letter was marked as such by the men who wrote it. The Black Hand did not end. It was absorbed, reorganized, and institutionalized into structures so much larger than itself that the original form became unrecognizable within the new one. But what it left behind persisted in ways that no organizational chart can fully capture. The fear economy the Black Hand built in Italian immigrant communities shaped those communities' relationship with American law enforcement for a generation after the last letter was delivered. The children of men and women who had lived under Black Hand extortion inherited not the specific threat, but the disposition it had produced, the reflex of silence when approached by official authority, the instinct that community matters were resolved internally or not resolved at all, the cultural architecture of omertà, not as a criminal code, but as a survival strategy absorbed through the specific historical experience of living in a community where speaking to the authorities had demonstrably, repeatedly, and lethally failed to produce protection. This inherited disposition had consequences that extended far beyond organized crime. It shaped how Italian-American communities related to civic institutions across a range of contexts where the specific threat of the Black Hand was entirely absent. The silence was not always rational, not always appropriate, not always in the community's actual interest in any given situation. But it was deeply conditioned behavior, produced by genuine historical experience. And it did not disappear when the letters stopped arriving. It faded slowly across generations as the specific historical conditions that had produced it receded, and as Italian Americans built institutional relationships with the broader society that provided alternative frameworks for engaging with official authority. But it faded slowly. The conditioning was deep. The omertà that the Black Hand enforced through terror became the omertà that the American Mafia enforced through tradition and organizational discipline. The code of silence that investigators and prosecutors spent the entire second half of the 20th century trying to penetrate. The two versions of the code were not the same thing. The Black Hand's silence was maintained through fear of immediate, personal violence against anyone who spoke. The Mafia's omertà was maintained through a combination of institutional loyalty, economic self-interest, and the awareness that cooperation with federal authorities carried its own lethal consequences. But they operated on the same psychological substrate. The understanding, born in Sicilian peasant culture and reinforced by a century of experience in America, that the official system was not your protector, and that speaking to it was more likely to harm than to help you. The Black Hand's specific contribution to American organized crime was methodological, the transfer into the American urban context of an understanding of how fear functions as an economic resource. Fear, properly managed, is a product that can be sold. The man who can credibly threaten violence and who demonstrates the willingness to follow through on that threat becomes the seller. The man who is threatened becomes the buyer of the product. Safety, purchased through regular tribute payments. The market this creates is self-sustaining as long as the seller's credibility is maintained through occasional enforcement and as long as no external power is capable of providing the buyer with alternative protection at a lower cost. The American legal system spent the entire first half of the 20th century failing to be that alternative protection at a cost the Black Hand's victims could afford. The NYPD failed because it lacked the investigative tools, the cultural knowledge, and the witness cooperation that effective prosecution required. The federal government succeeded only at the margins, only through jurisdictional hooks unrelated to the extortion itself, and only in ways that removed specific operators without dismantling the system. The Black Hand operated for 2 decades at industrial scale, precisely because the gap between its victims' vulnerability and the official system's protective capacity was enormous, consistent, and exploitable. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, passed in 1970, represented the legal system's most serious attempt to build a prosecutorial tool adequate to the organizational reality of American organized crime. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge an entire criminal organization as a criminal enterprise, to aggregate individual criminal acts into a pattern of racketeering, and to hold organizational leadership accountable for crimes committed by members, even without direct evidence of the leader's personal involvement in each specific act. It was, in structural terms, the legal recognition that the previous century of prosecution had produced. The recognition that the Black Hand and its successors had never been primarily about individual criminals committing individual crimes, but about organizational systems generating systematic criminal outcomes. The RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and early 1990s, the Commission case of 1986 that convicted the bosses of all 5 New York families, the Gotti prosecution, the Scarfo family prosecution in Philadelphia, the Patriarca family prosecution in New England, represented genuine dismantling of organizational structures that the Black Hand had seeded and that Prohibition and the Commission had built to maturity. The men convicted were not symbols. They were the operational leadership of institutions that had been extracting tribute, committing violence, and corrupting public officials in American cities for 100 years. Their conviction and incarceration disrupted those institutions in ways that earlier prosecutions, targeted at individual crimes by individual defendants, had consistently failed to achieve. But the fear economy did not disappear. The specific organizational forms were disrupted. The institutions that had grown from the Black Hand method were weakened, fragmented, and reduced in operational scale. But the method itself, the understanding that vulnerability combined with credible violence produces extractable tribute, passed from the Italian organized crime families into other criminal organizations that were growing in the same urban environments where the Black Hand had operated a century earlier. Street gangs in the same neighborhoods where Lupo the Wolf had written his letters developed tribute systems for the businesses within their territory that operated on identical economic logic. Prison gangs developed extortion systems within correctional institutions that replicated the Black Hand's mechanics with precision. The letter replaced by a verbal communication, the handprint replaced by gang insignia, the fear economy maintained through the same calibrated enforcement that had made the original system work. The insight that vulnerability is a resource that can be monetized turned out to be permanently useful knowledge. It did not belong to the Sicilian immigrant community. It was not specific to the cultural conditions that produced the Black Hand's particular form. It was a general truth about human economic behavior under conditions of inadequate institutional protection, where people cannot rely on official systems to protect them. They become customers in informal protection markets. Where those markets are organized by men willing to use violence, the Black Hand model reproduces itself without requiring any reference to its historical origin. Joseph Petrosino died in the Piazza Marina in Palermo on March 12, 1909. His body was returned to New York. His funeral drew 250,000 people to the streets of Manhattan in one of the largest public gatherings the city had ever seen. He was buried in Calvary Cemetery in Queens. His headstone reads, Detective Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino. His memory is still honored annually by the NYPD at a ceremony in Lower Manhattan. Ignazio Lupo died in his bed in Brooklyn in 1947. He died, by the standards of the world he had operated in, of old age. He had served portions of 2 federal sentences, had returned to criminal activity between and after them, and had outlived virtually everyone who had known him in the years of his greatest power. No museum bears his name, no ceremony marks his memory. The murder stable at 318 East 107th Street was demolished decades ago. The building that stands on that lot today has no marker, no plaque, no acknowledgement of what the ground beneath it once held. The letters stopped. The black handprints stopped appearing at the bottom of demands delivered to frightened men in the Italian neighborhoods of American cities. The Black Hand, as a recognizable phenomenon with a recognizable name, faded from newspaper coverage and law enforcement reports as prohibition reorganized the criminal economy and the mafia's institutionalized structures absorbed its operators and systematized its methods. But the fear economy it built, the fundamental architecture of systematic extortion sustained by credible violence against communities too vulnerable to resist, did not stop. It reorganized. It found new operators, new victims, new organizational forms suited to new urban conditions. It became the operational substrate of American organized crime in every form that followed the Black Hand's specific historical moment. Lupo the Wolf had not built an empire. He had built a template. The empire came later, built by men who had learned from what he demonstrated. The template was the contribution, and templates, unlike empires, do not require their architects to survive. They require only that someone understand them well enough to apply them. In American criminal history, that has never been a difficult requirement to meet.